The scripture reading this morning is from the book of Psalms. It's Psalm 15. It's the Psalm of David. O Lord, who may abide in your tent? Who may dwell on your holy hill? Those who walk blamelessly and do what is right and speak the truth from their heart, who do not slander with their tongue and do no evil to their friends, nor take up a reproach against their neighbor, in whose eyes the wicked are despised, but who honor those who fear the Lord, who stand by their oath even to their hurt, who do not lend money at interest and do not take a bribe against the innocent. Those who do these things shall never be moved. Praise God for his word of God to everyone.
Thanks be to God.
Our gospel lesson this morning comes to us from the Gospel of Matthew, in chapter 5, verses 1 to 12. This is actually part of a much longer event called the Sermon on the Mount. Almost a day-long conversation that Jesus has with a group of followers sitting on the side of a hill overlooking the Sea of Galilee. You can go to Israel today and you can sit on what historians believe was that same grassy hill on the same side of a mountain with the lake behind you, and just can sense what it must have been like to have heard Jesus speak these words. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and he sat down. His disciples came to him and he began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." My friends, this is the word of God for us, the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Well, some of you already know that I first left New England in the fall of 1971 to head down south to North Carolina to Duke University, where I was enrolled in the PhD program in the history department. I had a passion for military history in those days, and I was going to get a PhD in military history, become a doctor, become a professor, and come back to New England to do what I thought I would always do, which is to teach history. I know it sounds kind of strange to know that your minister, your Methodist pastor, was once a student of guns and battles, of generals and privates. And yet one of the key principles of military warfare that has come down to us over the centuries is one that seems to have crept into our daily living. It's the idea that the best defense is a good offense. This simple belief has become ingrained in Western culture. Our children, whether we understand it or not, are raised with this kind of understanding in mind. Everything in our world today is a head-on, flat-out, face-to-face confrontation with the idea that the one that has the most power, the most might, the most authority is the one that wins. Now, in marked contrast to that, the Eastern, the Asian forms of martial arts have very little in common with this idea that bigger is better, or that whoever has the most toys win. The kinds of principles that lie behind Western combat tactics. Eastern martial techniques such as judo, karate, and tai chi are seen as philosophies for life, more than simply defensive practices. And the key to each of these is basically the same idea, that you use your enemy's weight, strength, and agility to your own advantage. Allow your enemies, if they insist, to defeat themselves. Now, some of you may think it's kind of strange to talk about military matters and martial arts on a Sunday morning, but some of the best expressions of this Eastern philosophy of martial arts are going to be found in the words that we've just read in Matthew in our lesson today. In these first 12 verses of chapter 5, the section we call the Beatitudes, Jesus offers a series of what appears to be intentionally self-destructive personal choices, which he reveals ultimately as the way Christians will ultimately win against those who seek to harm them. Being poor in spirit, mourning for others, being meek, being one who hungers and thirsts for righteousness, being merciful, being pure in heart, being a peacemaker. Now, we might call all this the art of being a defensive Christian. The whole idea here is not to return tit for tat, eye for an eye, or strength for strength. The point instead is to step back and let those who attack us, to let their strength benefit and bless us in return. In this part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives us his best outline of how to deal with those who would persecute us. But let's be honest, we read these section of Matthew, we read the Beatitudes, we shake our heads in disbelief. How can we possibly learn to live our lives this way? How can we become practitioners of this ancient art of defensive Christianity, learning to meet aggression and hatred with passivity and patience, learning how to redirect blind hostility into wide-eyed activity? Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of Mother Teresa. When she first began her ministry of caring for the dying on the streets of Calcutta, India, she and the group that gathered around her, called the Sisters of Charity, were obstructed at every turn by government officials and Orthodox Hindus who were very suspicious of her motives. After all, she was not one of them. She was from away, if we would use the term we use here in New England, and they were suspicious. They used their authority to harass her, to frustrate her efforts at every turn. She and her Sisters of Charity were insulted, sometimes threatened with physical violence as they would walk the streets of Calcutta. Occasionally showers of stones and bricks would rain down on the women as they would work to gather up dying individuals and take them to their humble shelter. One morning, Mother Teresa was out walking when she noticed a group of people outside a nearby Kali temple, one of the most holy places for Hindus in Calcutta. As she drew closer, she saw that there was a man stretched out on the street with eyes rolled back and with a face that was drained of blood. A triple braid of hair denoted that he was of the Brahmin class, which meant he was an aristocrat in Indian culture. This was not a simple temple priest. This is a high holy individual. No one dared touch him, for the people who had gathered around recognized that he was dying of cholera. Mother Teresa worked her way through the crowd. She bent down. She took the body of the Brahmin priest in her arms, and she carried the man back to her shelter. Day in and night in, she nursed and cared for this man, and eventually the priest recovered. Over and over again, he would say to his people, "For 30 years, I have worshipped a Kali, a god of stone. But I have met in this gentle woman a real Kali, a god of flesh and blood." After that event, the Sisters of Charity never had to worry about walking the streets of Calcutta. Mother Teresa had mastered the art of incorporating the principles that are embedded in the Beatitudes into her daily living. Like Jesus, she would let the other person make the first move. She would focus on listening and learning, not automatically defending herself when attacked. She would take time to discover the underlying premise that motivated their hatred, their fear, their stubbornness. Recognizing sometimes that those who opposed her might well have genuine and legitimate concerns. Sometimes she would ask why the Orthodox Hindus hated her so, why her beliefs were so bothersome to them. After all, no position is so strong that it cannot be improved by gaining insights from others. Mother Teresa sought daily to embody the understanding and compassion that Jesus counsels in the Beatitudes. And when the time was right, she would seize the opportunity to minister to her enemies, opening the way for a release of their hostilities, opening the way for them to be able to communicate as brothers and sisters. Now, unfortunately, the precepts of defensive Christianity sometimes will fail to diffuse an explosive confrontation. Back in the days of the Roman emperors, there were plenty of well-fed lions in the Colosseum at Rome who could testify to the fact that aggressiveness and violence often did overwhelm the practice of defensive Christianity. Jesus' promise in the Beatitudes is not that we will be victorious 100% of the time. What Jesus does promise is that we will be blessed 100% of the time. It's the loving techniques found in the Beatitudes that will transform curses into blessings. It's the countercultural techniques of the Beatitudes that will empower the church to stop trying to keep up with the Joneses and instead be about the business of lifting crosses and rolling away stones. That's the message for us today from the Beatitudes. Thanks be to God. Amen.